Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with some great guests that I think you're really going to enjoy. So, if you're like me, you're on Twitter and all of this news just kind of rolls past you constantly. It's a weird place because in some ways you encounter a lot of bad stuff that you never would have encountered, but you also run into many stories that otherwise would have flown entirely under the radar if you had not been kind of plugged into kind of this hub of the journalistic consciousness in the tech space. And one of the things that kind of came up, it didn't get much play in America, but it did make some waves kind of on the Twitter sphere, was the fact that there was this scandal going on in Canada about these residential schools, these indigenous groups, these children who might have been buried in these mass graves, kind of the churches that were burned in response to this, a whole bunch of different controversy that surrounded this. Now, a little while ago, it became clear that many parts of this story might have been untrue or completely fabricated, and that has now kind of trickled its way into the more mainstream press. The United States, the UK, other areas have become more aware of this narrative. So I wanted to go back, look at this story, get an idea of what was going on and what we've discovered. And joining me to do that today are two of my favorite Canadians, two of my favorite Leafs. We of course have the great Substacker Kruptos. Thanks for joining me, sir.
Hey, pleasure to be on. Auron, thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. And of course, one of our favorites. He is an artist. He is a scholar. He is a co-host of a podcast with one of our other
Republican
favorite
thought leader as well.
Republican thought leader. Absolutely. He is Giant Gio. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you. And the reason I don't have a fez is because I feel like serious subject matter. So I'm putting on my serious hat metaphysically.
This is this is the most serious I've ever seen Gio. So that definitely speaks to the gravity of the situation. Appreciate him, kind of bringing the more somber tone to this, because I think it is something that is pretty significant and something we need to look at in real detail. So, guys, I'm not sure which one of you kind of want to take us out on this a little bit, but most Americans are probably completely unfamiliar with the history here. What are residential schools? What do they have to do in relation to the Indigenous population in Canada? And what did this controversy kind of entail?
Well, I think Kruptos should go first because not to age dox, not to dry snitch, but he's been around a lot longer than both of us, especially in Canada. So
Yeah, the thing about the residential schools is they were a largely, and this is part of the whole story, they were largely a progressive solution to solve the quote unquote Indian problem in a sense. So Canada was put together as a mix of you had the British conquering the French and the native tribes, and rather than say annihilate everybody, they reached settlements with both the French and also with the natives in terms of reserves. And over the years, these settlements have been negotiated and renegotiated. They get special tax breaks and so forth. Now, the reserves have experienced all kinds of problems. There are problems with alcoholism. For whatever reason, the native population just has an intolerance. Like some people groups have intolerance to milk or cheese. The native population does not react well to alcohol, and so for some tribes, that even several drinks can basically make them alcoholics. So you have some of these issues. So then what happens to the kids of some of these folks that have been, in a sense, damaged through the process of conquest, the reserves, just the sort of the marginalized place that Native Canadians have been in Canadian society. So you get these kids who are sometimes parentless, or the parents are unable to take care of them. They're with grandma and grandpa. Then you have this whole progressive ideology in a sense. We're going to help the native population integrate into Canada, and so you begin to pack up a lot of these kids and you put them into schools that are government funded, but end up being run by churches, by the Catholic Church, by the United Church, and so forth. And
the Anglican Church as well.
Anglican churches, and so some of these schools were phenomenal. Like you go through the list of stories, and while you can hear horror stories, and there's no denying some of these places were not good places, and some of the teachers were terrible people. There are also some very good stories that come out of it, like people who will claim that their lives were saved by the residential schools and so forth and so forth. So you often have underfunded teachers, pastors, priests working in these residential schools, trying to do the best that they can with many of these kids who come in bringing problems with them and try to deal with a tough situation. And then, kids get sick, they die. They often put in requests for proper burials, they get denied. And so they're, just buried in the churchyard. And then eventually people realize, like, well, maybe this whole sense of forced enculturation is maybe not the most of progressive ideas. And eventually they were shut down, like what, mid 90s they ran up until, right? I think they were still going into the 90s.
The last major one was in the 1960s, if I recall, but up until the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. And so they get shut down, but then now there's this legacy. So you have this, what do we make of them as Canadians? Are they a good thing, a bad thing? And generally people have sort of settled on, well, this was a terrible era in Canadian history, right? And so then you have a chief and a tribe out in BC who, makes the case that, well, their oral history of their tribe, so the stories they tell themselves, say that these schools were horrible and that there are children buried in there. There's like quote unquote mass graves. So somebody takes some ground penetrating radar, goes out and finds what looks like on the ground penetrating radar to be skeletons. And then everything blows up in the press. And Justin Trudeau makes the comments that, well, that their feelings are justified. Well, people said there was some. I think the first what happened is some churches got burned in response to this, and then Trudeau made the comment, well, people's feelings about this are very understandable. And then realizing that he'd made a big blunder, tries to walk it back and say, well, of course, attacks on churches are uncalled for. But I think there's something like we're north of 80 churches now have been set fire or vandalized in some like severe way. And so now it remains open, but there was always from the very beginning a segment of the population who were very skeptical, a number of academics, some of whom lost their jobs because of that. I'm trying to see if I can get her name. But anyways, and so they have maintained that there really isn't anything to this, and people were actually saying, like, listen, we don't want to shy away from the history. We don't want to say that these places were all sunshine and roses. That bad things did happen. Some people did get sexually abused. Some kids did end up dying of disease and neglect because they didn't get proper medical care. But sometimes because the teachers and pastors and priests were trying to tell the government, hey, these kids need medical care, but they weren't being gotten. And so, nobody wants to shy away from it. But at the same time, people say, like, listen, this story of mass graves and stuff really just, it strains credulity. And
well, yeah, but before we get into then kind of what was discovered there, I want to address a few of the things that you kind of brought up. So in some ways, there is a echo of this experience in the United States, because there was this tension between, like you said, you have these these initial negotiations, and Native Americans were pushed kind of further and further into different parts of America that weren't settled yet, and eventually so much of the area was settled that reservations were established. And the big question that many people asked was, what do we do? Do we try to make these people American, because their way of life is dead now, right? There's no way that they can continue completely in their traditional tribal mode of being. They've made too much contact with kind of modern European peoples, and so they're not going to go back that way. And so a lot of people made the argument that these people need to be Christianized, they need to be modernized, they need to be brought into kind of American culture, and these schools were set up. At the same time, there was a turning away from that eventually, and more of a respect for, okay, actually you should be able to continue your way as life as much as possible. And so like reservations were respected more and set up. And so I don't think this is only the Canadian experience here. But it sounds like this hysteria that was fed into a little bit because of the way this was framed. And it's really the reaction that was seen as justifiable that I think is the most shocking part of this. Because like you said, people had contested this from the beginning, but they were fired, they were silenced. There seemed to be basically almost a legal blackout of Canadian media on discussing any other views on what could be true about this, that kind of thing. I remember one of the reasons this came on my radar is all of these churches were burning down, and people like Lauren Southern were saying, "Oh no, this isn't true. There's evidence that this isn't true," and she was just shouted down, called a racist, completely canceled. I believe the Pope ended up apologizing for this.
He did.
Justin
Yep.
Trudeau ended up, like you said, justifying this. I mean, those churches burned, and was anyone brought to justice for that? Was anyone ever held
Well,
accountable for that?
well, if Kruptos, I have a few points. If you wanted to finish,
Well, I
finish
was
up.
going to say too, like it's interesting. Like even the burning of churches is controversial in the Native community because many of these churches are active, functioning like centers of community life in the reserve communities, right?
Yes.
So it's not like they were attacking like the white man's religion, whatever, blah blah blah. These are their own churches, right? That people were burning down.
Right.
Well, we have to distinguish that the vast majority of these church burnings were not done by Indigenous people. They were done by
No,
white Antifa and other
leftists.
and leftist groups. Yes, there maybe have been a few Indigenous people involved, but these churches they do provide community centers and so forth. But yeah, yeah. So, but
It,
I what? Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead,
Go
Jim.
ahead,
No,
Craig.
you go ahead. You go ahead, Jim.
Well, what I wanted to say is that to be as optical as possible, I may come off as being a bit liberal, but I have a great respect and reverence for the Indigenous people. But I think another thing, the historical context would be that the experience between the French and the British in Canada is quite different in some respects than Americans. Well,
Mhm.
I mean, Americans were British at one time, but you know what I mean,
I do.
Americans, especially after when the Constitution was established and so forth. And let's face it, you did have a lot of horrific abuses and outright, you know, campaigns against the Indigenous people in America. People talk about Andrew Jackson and so forth. But in Canada, because of the vastness of the wilderness and because of going way back to Champlain and the French, the reliance between settlers and the Indigenous people that were already here, the establishment was a bit different because of having to deal with the Canadian wilderness itself. And then later on, when settlements were established by the British and French, then you start to have a different character of relationships between the Indigenous people and the British and the French and so forth, for Anglophone and Francophone. For those who are American that don't know that's what we call it here in Canada. So, but I would say that when it comes to the issue, the contemporary church burnings, we have to realize that yes, the residential school system, in a lot of ways, even if there was many positive experiences, as Krupto says, but the issue is the sort of nature of it themselves, in the sense that they are taking children and they're placing them vast distances sometimes from
Mhm.
their reservations. If the program would have been done differently, if there would have been schools established on the reservations, and in a lot of sense, in a lot of cases, these children were being protected by abuses on the reservations. But then, of course, because of lack of oversight and funding, there was horrific amounts of abuse in some places
Mhm.
of a sexual and physical nature. But when it comes to the issue of children dying, now there were higher than average amounts of child mortality rates on and off reservations for Indigenous children. And this is for a variety of reasons. Neglect, also genetically, when it comes to, say, uh, descendants of European children that have exposure much more to, certain pathogens and so forth. The tuberculosis rates, the rates of diphtheria and other illnesses. There was a big study done after World War I on a lot of these grave sites and these children. A lot of it was disease. And also, I would say that, yes, there were childhood deaths attributed to abuse. This is a fact that we cannot shy away from. Now, when it comes to the definition of, I can't say it for YouTube, for Auron's channel's sake, but let's call it G-word-eyed. The discourse in Canada is that, do the residential schools constitute a form of cultural G-word-eyed? Now, I would say that trying to get rid of their language and culture and taking away these children all the way up to the 60s, I would say that, yes, I would agree that that in itself was, like Kruptos said, may have been the liberalism of the day. But still, in terms of contemporary standards, yes, that was an incredible abuse, and the lack of oversight and everything. We cannot shy away from this. But when it comes to the contemporary political context of these church burnings that are result from the issue of the quote-unquote mass graves, this is the problem. When you use that word, mass grave, we all know, again, for YouTube, we
all know what it conjures. Yeah.
We all know that event in the 20th century that it conjures, okay? Mid-century, So I think that it was a combination of media politicking, passive admission by the Trudeau government that it's almost, not Trudeau himself, but there were certainly members of the Trudeau government that said that not only was this justified, but like there were some that were almost passively cheering it on, right? But also when it comes to Indigenous people themselves, another factor is that while this whole thing about mass graves is going on, there was always this relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Liberal Party. We have to realize that there are still reservations in Canada that do not have running water, that people live in almost third world conditions. And Trudeau has been, how long has it been, Kruptos? 8 years? Since Trudeau
at least.
Well, and this is going back to his father, or, well, I guess stepfather, whatever. But for his father, the relationship, I don't mean to joke, but the relationship between
the are there.
Yeah, but the relationship between the Liberal Party and Indigenous communities has been long established, has been a contentious one. And I think that it's done a massive disservice to neglect the real abuses and to conjure a fantastical story about mass graves and other things that conjures up. When we have reservations and people that live in reservations that are not having their needs met despite the funding. Now, you have to remember the one thing. Now, listen, Stephen Harper is not, by American standards, would be the bluest of blue dog, or whatever you want to call it, rhinos, right? He'd be the bluest of rhinos. Okay, he is not a far-right person. But during his administration, he wanted to push through what he called the Accountability Act, to say that for a long time, when it comes to funding for reservations and Indigenous programs, there has been kind of a lack of oversight. The first thing that Trudeau did when he came to power was to get rid of Stephen Harper's Accountability Act, right? Now, this was not a far-right thing. This was Stephen Harper we're talking about here. But the first thing that Trudeau did was get rid of it. Now, I think that it's a combination of a lack of oversight, political passivity within the culture of the Liberal Party, but also this sort of media fabulation that, in part, you have to realize the context. This is 2021. This is coming off of the Summer of Love in America. A lot of what liberals do and leftists do in Canada is they have to create a similar atmosphere as a lot of contentious leftist political issues in America. And I believe that a lot of the driving force in terms of the media, in terms of the liberals in the media, is basically to say that, okay, we can have also, kind of like the Democrats in the States, we can have our issues too. And all of this is in the backdrop of the real world problems that Indigenous people face in Canada. Now, the rates of women disappearing as well, Indigenous women who escape horrific abuses on the reservations that end up in places like Vancouver and end up tragically being, trafficked and so forth. Some of them meeting people like Robert Pickton. That, by the way, was a huge blunder with policing in Canada and Vancouver in particular. I mean, all of these issues go unmentioned because of the sort of the media apparatus around the resident around, the quote unquote mass graves. And there's been a lot of journalists, people on the political left, like Terry Glavin, who published that article that he got absolutely fragged for in the National Post. A man who's been talking about and writing about Indigenous issues for multiple decades, since at least the 1980s. Terry Glavin is not a right-wing person. He is a lib, right? But he was dragged through the mud. His name was dragged through the mud. And yes, there are problems with his reporting as well. There was this, for example, in Canada Land, which is more of a leftist liberal publication, they, poked holes in his story, but they were pretty fair. But despite that, he still stuck his neck out to say that maybe there should be greater accountability by journalists when it comes to reporting on Indigenous issues, because he had been reporting on Indigenous issues for a very long time from a liberal perspective. And that's just one example. And Kruptos was saying there's academics who have been also dragged through the mud because of it. Some of them were also Indigenous people, by the way, that were in Indigenous studies, that said that maybe this is the wrong approach to addressing the lived experiences of Indigenous people in Canada. So that's my little rant. I just wanted to, nuance this whole thing, because I do admit that it's a very tragic history when it comes to residential schools, and the way that it was set up does constitute abuse when it comes to taking children. And right up into the 1960s, I know Indigenous people who have been a product of that, seizure efforts, during the 60s of Indigenous children. So, but the way that they approached it, the way that it fomented hatred and abuse towards churches, and there were Orthodox churches that got burned, because of course, it's like the media.
They all look the same, right? Yeah.
They all look the same, exactly.
Well, if you look at the map of where these 83 churches are that have been vandalized, right? They're like spread all over Canada, like in urban areas, out east, up north, in places in Ontario there were native populations everywhere, and there's reserves everywhere. I mean, the whole history of the the quote unquote native problem has been difficult from the get-go, because the solution of the reserves, and then largely the federal government just funding the life of Native Canadians has also been disastrous for them, because it really it shows you what like rampant welfare will do to a people in terms of just destroying them. And it's been tragic, because you basically you take away all of the initiative, the self-drive, whatever is left culturally of a people to be themselves, become themselves, is just gone. And then you deal with the corruption, the grift, and everything. And it has just been a festering problem for years and years now. There's land disputes. In southwestern Ontario, we've dealt with it numerous times, where they've shut down like major highways, blocked off a whole section of southern Ontario, just basically set up blockades and just dared the government to come in and take it away from them, right? These sorts of things. And then up by Ipperwash, same sort of deal, where they just took over provincial park and just said, this is ours. Right, and then dared the government to come in and take it away from them. Right, so these standoffs have been going on for quite some time. And
the Oka crisis back in the
Oka
90s.
crisis, and so, but this residential school, from a propaganda perspective, gave the liberal government and leftist activists a perfect opportunity to shift the blame from where it properly belongs, which is, a half a century of government mismanagement and bad ideas, and to just kind of wink and nod and say, oh, you know what? It was the Christians' fault. And that was basically, like, nobody really said it out loud, except Trudeau kind of did.
Yeah, kind of did, yeah.
Well, Gerald Butts did, his big advisor.
Basically said, and there was a couple of people out in BC who ended up resigning, activists, because they tweeted out, they have it coming. And but it wasn't just like, because it isn't just one church, and as Gio was saying too, because it's a lot of this is, Antifa thugs, young left-wing activists, doing a lot of this. It isn't just anger being born out of the Native community that is sort of like now they can kind of release all these feelings that they've had for years and years. A lot of it is just the purely a creation of propaganda. You have left-wing activists that had an issue now and were given permission to basically go and engage in a pogrom against Christians in Canada. And the prime minister just basically winked and nodded and did nothing. Like, I don't think anybody's ever been prosecuted for it at all. Like, there's no, I mean, I may have missed a story, but there's none that comes to mind where a single person has actually been prosecuted for the whole thing. And
yeah, I mean, I hate to be the American that just is like, this is just like America, but I mean, in this case, I think it's appropriate. It's hard not to pretend like this isn't, again, as kind of Gio pointed out, a mirror of the BLM situation, where you had a community, whether people felt they had legitimate grievances or not, whose attempts at this thing, which were kind of violent on their end, were only magnified by basically government sponsored activists who went out of their way to turn a particular isolated incident into a nationwide violent spree of rioting that was, again, 100% subsidized and approved by the government itself. And Canada, in this scenario, they're burning down churches, they're tearing down statues. You can see, again, it feels like this is a feature almost of kind of these global American empire affiliated to countries, to have this pattern emerge of saying, like you were saying, Joe, we can do this too. We can signal our allegiance to kind of the home political party by having a similar event here and showing our battle against oppression and co-opting it in the same way, driving out activists in the same way, having the same wink and nod acceptance by the government, the lack of any kind of law enforcement, the anarcho tyranny. You just mirroring the kind of the ruling formula in a different place with a different issue. It rhymes with with the same kind of events that happen there.
100%. I mean, like, for example, I mean, well, the model is, like I've always said, the psychology of it is very interesting because, libs in Canada are kind of like the bluest of blue dog Democrats. Like, they as much as they hate America and they hate the sort of, like, I would say, truncated old version of, like, John Stewart Jesus Land version of America that probably doesn't exist anymore, or maybe, well, under Trump it was sort of revived to them. They really, spiritually, they sort of have the same model. I mean, let's remember that there was a period during 2020 where they're like, well, we don't have any Confederate general statues to get rid of. Who are we going to get rid of? Oh, Johnny McDonald. And let's face it, yes, of course, Johnny McDonald had a problematic relationship to the Indigenous people. But I mean, it's basically the equivalent of, like, well, in America, let's get rid of George Washington's statue. That's like, in terms of founding of modern Canada. Did they get rid of George Washington statues?
They were pulling down Abraham Lincoln statues. They were pulling down Teddy Roosevelt statues.
Lincoln.
Washington.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, nobody was safe.
No.
I mean, well, and they were. I think they were pulling down, statues of the Queen and stuff in Canada, right? So,
yes,
again,
yes.
Nothing different there, I feel.
The one difference between the Canadian one and the Canadian situation, the U.S. situation, has been the direct scapegoating of the Christian community,
right,
for this, right? And that's the marker. So, like, over the last summer, we all made fun of James Lindsay for his his knock on Christian nationalists, and so how this was going to bring the state down.
Going to bring the summer apocalypse that was going to doom America. Yeah.
So, and I mean, we all kind of mocked him for it because it was kind of ridiculous. But yet at the same time, there's those of us who live in Canada who are going like, well, okay, James Lindsay's kind of a ridiculous figure, and this is sort of like the summer of the apocalypse is probably a little bit thing. But let me talk to you about these church burnings that we got going up here. And so, we often talk about, so how is the West and everything going to end, and what's going to happen, and what's it going to be like, right? And one of the things you can see that if the regime becomes stressed, it's amazing how Canada has become a test case for like, like with the trucker dispute. How do you deal with like large scale, like really serious, threatening, um, revolts, protests that you can't manage or handle? Well, they showed the model. You start freezing their bank accounts, and you take care, like, you may be at the protest, but when your wife goes to go grocery shopping and finds out that the whole business accounts are shut down, boy, that protest, sweetheart, you better just come on home here and just, that type of thing. And in this way, I get the sense that in some ways the Canadian government is also showing the way that, as when push comes to shove and you get criticism. Now, because of the direct involvement of the churches in the residential school, they made for an easy scapegoat, and it made a
Yes.
very convenient way for them to deflect attention away from the government, predominantly liberal in Canada. Over the years, Canada's governments have been like 3-1 liberal to conservative.
They call it the natural governing party here in Canada.
That's exactly it, right? And so the most of these situations have been presided over by liberals over the long term. And so rather than deal with how their own policies over the years have failed right from the very beginning, from the misguided notion of progressivism as it worked itself out and how we're going to, bring these kids along and give them a better life and all this kind of nonsense, anglicize them and the whole bit, right up to sort of the current conditions. And they can just sort of whitewash all of it. It just kind of memory holes the whole thing, because who's to blame? Well, it's the schools and the churches that ran them. They're the bad guys. And so now you can create a scapegoat, you can dump problems off onto them, and nobody is paying attention to the real villain, which is, the liberal administrative state and their terrible policies. And so you can see this as a kind of template. Now, they may not be able to get away with it in every situation, but you can definitely see a kind of template at work. And you can sort of see too, like even in the US, from a progressive messaging system, in this sense, there is a certain correctness to what James Lindsay is saying, is that progressivism is built on the idea of always moving forward. So if, let's say, the natural state of things is that you reach a limit where your inputs no longer are generating the outputs and you're no longer moving forward and you need to blame somebody, well, who are those that oppose progress? Well, it is those backwards Christians. Now, have they not done anything specific? Now, in this case, you had a very specific target. They ran the schools, you can target them, and it's very focused. But you can also see it happening in a similar sense, that if the state gets more and more pressed, that you now have this model of, you can say, well, we haven't been able to realize progress because these backwards Christians have been holding us back. And if we could just do something about these backward Christians, then we'll be able to move forward with progress. And that's the template there. And that's really, the Canadian government didn't quite go out to say it so much, but it was a sense of like, well, this may have worked had it not been for the churches that ran it, because they were all basically child molesters and horrible people. And then you have it set up from, the church scandals in the Catholic Church sort of, helped lay the groundwork for it. So like, oh, it's infinitely believable now that, well, all these Christians are just basically pederasts and child molesters, and they're all horrible monsters. And, you get these people standing up and going like, wait a minute, the schools may not have been sunshine and flowers, but they aren't what you're telling us they are. And then meanwhile, the churches are burning because, white Antifa thugs are setting fire to them in the middle of the night. And the prime minister is saying, well, it's understandable that there's, that these things are happening. And they're like, oh, really? It's understandable that they're happening, right? And so you can see a kind of template being generated for the future.
So let me ask the obvious question here, and to be fair, understand this is coming from a guy who just watched his entire country knuckle under after talking about their ability to resist government tyranny for years here recently. So I'm not throwing any shade on you guys, but like, what's up with Christians in Canada? Did everyone just stand by quietly and watch their churches burn? Was there no popular resistance to the what's the state of the church in Canada? What's the state of is there any resilience? Is there any resistance?
You have to understand though too, Auron, that of the population who identifies as Christian, I think, what is it, maybe 30% of the population identifies as Christian, and maybe if you're lucky, 5 to 7% are active churchgoers. Whereas in the US, it's like what, 80% of the people identify themselves as Christian, and something like 35 to 40% go to church twice a month at least, right?
Mm.
Kind of thing. And so in Canada, Christians represent a significant minority. And so even if we were to get up in arms, that the majority of the population is really, they're not on your side, so to speak.
And the minority status, I'm guessing, not granting you any kind of privilege there.
No, God, no.
Not really. No.
Because being religious is coded as being American, being like a Trump supporter or whatever. So to like a lot of the urban like libs that live in Canada, like that's basically anathema. Even like the United Church, which is basically the United Social Club of Canada, where they have like, impossible women Vikers and people, like they have people like who was that one guy that wrote that book about it, Tom Harpoo.
Oh, Tom,
like, he's like, I'm a bishop, but I don't
Yeah.
believe in God. I don't believe in Christ, but I'm a bishop still. It's like that religiosity in Canada in some ways has followed the trends of European countries as opposed to America.
So you could say, in some ways that the liberals will eventually take your children and put them into schools to re-educate them, and you drive like in the liberal tradition of eliminating
they do that already.
A minority.
Yes,
that's the joke.
Yeah, they're called public schools.
Yeah,
right.
But they do though. And
by the way, as a product of the Catholic school system, the separate because of the issue with Quebec, which I mean, wholesale dumped the Catholicism in the 60s because of the Silent Revolution. That's another issue for another time. As a product of the Catholic school system in Canada, I think they should just get rid of it. It's really not really Catholic besides going to a few services a few times a year and having an extra religious class and uniforms, and that's pretty much it. So, they have to raise the imperial flag of the empire every June. And the separate Catholic school system has to still raise the flag, right, of the empire.
Wow.
So, yeah.
The jig is up when you've got like what is the population, 10 to 15% sometimes of schools are Muslims, and you're realizing like how Catholic are your Catholic schools?
Well, Muslim parents, they send them to Catholic schools because of the uniforms and because of the extra religious classes, which is understandable. But and also another point of clarification people are pointing out in the chat is that there are quite a few reservations in Canada that are quite functional, and they managed to create industries both through resource extraction, timber, but also tourist industries and other various goods that I know the one in Caledonia here in Ontario, they have quite a good cigarette business, but because of the punishing taxes on cigarettes and all tobacco products here in Canada. But there are quite a few reservations that have managed to become modernized and have industries from, various industries. But unfortunately, it's the rural reservations, especially out in places like Winnipeg, that have essentially third world conditions. So go ahead,
Kruptos. Like North Ontario.
And Northern Ontario as well.
Yeah,
yes.
or like places like Thompson, Manitoba, and so forth, right? Like you get up north there, where your nearest major community is 6 to 8 hours away. Some of these places are like they literally have police organized. Like they're dry towns, and they enforce them to be dry, because if you get any alcohol in the town, if they hear of it, like they will break into your houses and so forth. So they're quite problematic. But you're right, Gio. There are some places that are high functioning and and produce very high level Canadians that integrate well into the power structures and so forth. But there are some also that are profoundly dysfunctional as well too.
Well, it's very funny how there's the protests against the oil industry. There's a lot of Indigenous people that are like, well, if you get rid of the oil industry for the environment, and you have people like David Suzuki and Margaret Atwood protesting, and American celebrities too, like B-list celebrities like that Rufo guy. Well, no, sorry, not Rufo, Ruffalo. You know that?
Mark Ruffalo, yeah.
Mark Ruffalo, yeah. There are Indigenous people that are like, if you get rid of these oil rigs, you get rid of our jobs. So it's ridiculous. Of course, America has this activist pipeline and so forth. But
we do have to conquer the world with our liberal activists. It's the only thing. Yeah. It's our saddest but most powerful export. So,
Hmm.
so let me ask you guys. Now we kind of know, right? There's been a lot of excavation. There's been more searching, and after years, there's been no. As I understand, they've produced like no bodies. There's been no mass graves. There's been a realization that pretty much all of this was false. That the story was entirely manufactured and promoted by activists in the media and even the government, who encouraged all these travesties. And but there's no there. And in the wake of all this censorship, people fired, churches destroyed, communities torn apart, like all of this stuff. Has there been any acknowledgement by the government? Has there been any acknowledgement by the people? Are you even allowed to talk about the fact that this is basically fake and that this was a huge scandal that was perpetrated on people in Canadian media at this point?
Well, what's interesting is that more American media has been open about it, but the only like really exceptions are sort of like the stalwart conservative papers like the National Post that have been, and various people like Rebel Media. Although let's face it, Rebel Media, they're an activist. They're like normie con activists. They're not really like a credible news source. Blah blah blah.
Like a
There's
Project
been
Veritas type.
yeah, Ezra Levant. I mean, I don't want to speak ill of anybody, but I have my own issues with Ezra Levant. But yeah, there's been people like that have been talked about it. But in terms of the acceptability of it, I mean, not to say that this would ever pass. I mean, you never know. But there has been, in Canada, I guess in America, you also have this culture with like, well, call it backbenchers. Here in Canada, they call minor MPs backbenchers. There are certain like activist people, like there's this one lady in the NDP. For those who don't know, the NDP, the New Democrat Party, they're like well, they're in a bit of an identity crisis now because because Trudeau is outliving them. They're sort of like there used to be the left Labor Party, but now
Mhm.
they're sort of like the more woker than Trudeau party. One of them proposed a bill against quote unquote residential school denialism in the name of quote unquote curbing disinformation. Right now, the problem with that is that nobody who has been critical of this is denying the reality of the residential school program, but also the abuses in the residential school program that did exist. It's just the context of a lot of these quote unquote mass graves were, for example, graves of children that did have, a lot of them did have markers, but because they were poor, the church didn't have a lot of resources, they were wooden markers and they weren't maintained by the communities that were there. You have cases where bodies were wrapped in coffins, were separated. So even the language itself of quote unquote mass grave as putting a large volume of children in a single location, it's, like I've said, people have the image of bodies being bulldozed into
Right,
pits and
right.
so forth. They were grave markers that were differentiated, that were given burial rates, and that in a lot of cases did have paperwork attached to them. It's just that they fell into disrepute. A lot of the reservations didn't have funding because, and again, this is where I am critical of the whole program of the residential school system, of taking children and placing them in different locations throughout the country than where they were born in the reservations. A lot of the children that belong to certain reservations, these reservations did not have the funding to go to these different places in Canada and have upkeep when it comes to these graves, right? And we could also say the child mortality rates disproportionately affected Indigenous children as well. So, but the problem is the rhetoric of calling it denialism is a very classic leftist tactic.
It's
As
loaded
we in
with very
America,
specific language and imagery, and in an
yes,
international, it has nothing
yes.
to do. It's not connected to
Yeah.
the event itself or to the culture itself or to the place in which it's being used. It's literally just being borrowed from a global narrative and being
Yes.
applied there so that it invokes certain types of
Yeah.
censorship, certain kind of faux pas.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
basically you're repeating World War II all over again,
Right.
Yeah.
and but the thing also too, like you're noting too, with the lack of funds to go and visit and maintain these grave sites, is part of the problem is that the government denied the funds in the first place for proper burials oftentimes.
Oh, I
So
didn't know this. I didn't know this.
so that
So
so there was that was one of the problems. They not only didn't get proper medical care, but when the times for burials came, the money was not there to say send the bodies back to families and all these types of things.
Yes.
So some of these priests they would say, like, listen, we wept for these kids, we did the best we could, and like these are like the positive stories, right? We did the best we could, but we could only do so much, right?
Yeah.
And so the government wants to really avoid having to face over and over again that they were the ones who dropped the ball, that they denied the proper funding, they denied proper oversight, they just basically fobbed this off on the churches. And then when the native communities tried to deal with it, just drag their feet in that end as well too in the after. And so this thing has come up. So it's again, to borrow Trudeau's language, it's not surprising that many of these native communities are just really, really upset about this whole thing and are willing to go kind of scorched earth, and even to the point of just making stuff up, or being willing to believe that there's quote unquote mass graves with all that implies, because for them as a community, that's their felt reality over the years. It's just kind of built and built and built, right? And then so it just becomes like a tinderbox that's just waiting to be set on fire. And
But also, I have a question though. Maybe is more towards Auron being an American. Is that like, well, Kruptos, you, we both know that Indigenous people are sort of more woven into the fabric of Canadian history and society and so forth. But it seems like in America, like then the Indigenous issue doesn't really come up as much as opposed to, say, African Americans or other historic groups. I mean, it seems that that there's not a same like, and you could argue that Indigenous people in America were treated way, way worse. And so I wonder, yeah.
Well, I think in
They-
America, it just gets lumped into the the oppressed class. As where in
Yeah.
Canada, you have, I think Canada has a more difficult time generating the emancipation narrative.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
oppression emancipation narrative, and so the Indigenous population becomes that for them in the same way it is in Australia, where
Yeah, the Aboriginals.
that's so important to them, as where in America African Americans and the idea of slavery and everything is much more tied to that. So the narrative remains the same. The role that the narrative plays in all of these societies is similar, but the object of focus zooms in and out depending on who is relevant, who is useful to kind of that deconstructive narrative. So I think that's why they take a more central role in Canada,
Yeah.
is because it's more useful. Trust me, I taught American history for quite a few years, and we spent plenty of
Yeah.
time talking about all the terrible injustices done. So that it's not that it doesn't exist in America; it's just that it gets folded, I think, into as a
Yeah.
secondary narrative, even though it's arguably quite more horrific, like you said, than perhaps other aspects. It gets
Yeah.
folded in, given a second seat.
And it was complicated on the frontier as well with you know the mythic American frontier has been such an ingrained thing within the identity of America itself. I mean, yeah, but sorry, go ahead, Kruptos, go ahead.
I was just going to ask Auron, like, I don't know, like, I know there's like some communities like in New England, and so forth, Vermont, and those places where they have some tribes. But generally, my sense of it is that most of them are in the plain states and out west, or maybe I'm mistaken. Where, like, if you go into, do you have reservations in, say, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and
Well,
so
New
forth?
York has a lot of them.
Yeah, we have
Pennsylvania.
reservations. We have
Everywhere. So
reservations.
so it's the same sort of situation then. Now, do you run into places like where they have conflicts with the reservations, or like it's not a story that you really hear? Like like you don't really hear about it a lot.
So in America, a lot of these reservations have been basically turned into kind of money factories by people who want to operate businesses that otherwise wouldn't be legal or be heavily taxed inside the United States. So, for instance, in Florida, the Seminole tribe owns all gambling. They own all casinos because they can operate them on their land. In fact, the Seminole tribe ran a they ran a basically a fake campaign to get rid of greyhound racing in Florida because parimutuel facilities were the only place besides Seminole reservation land that you could gamble in Florida, and so they pretended to care about animal rights, and they like ginned up all these animal rights activists to eliminate greyhound racing, just so they could eliminate their competition for for gambling profits in the United States.
I believe in Florida, the Italian mafia had to cut deals with a lot of indigenous reservations back in the day.
So they could run it like Nevada. Yeah. But so there is a weird relationship in the United States where a lot of these have been basically, the reservations still exist, but in many ways they become just land that is hollowed out and used entirely by corporate ventures that otherwise wouldn't be able to operate inside certain parts.
Good for them, though. I mean,
if you're going to secure the bag, right? Like, then do it that way. Though in many ways it ends up being like one guy who's 1/64th Seminole running the whole thing. So how much is the actual tribe? The thing is that most people in America are like some mixture of German, Irish,
and
Anglo-Saxon and Native American. Like that's that's a standard mix. That's my mix. That's to different degrees. That's most people's mixes in the United States. And so I don't know what the level of integrated, kind of genetic scenario is in Canada, but in America, that's a pretty, most people can probably trace one side or the other of their family to some Native American tribe somewhere.
Well, in Canada, there is also issue with status cards and the Métis and Kruptos, you probably know a lot more about that. So
well, in the especially in Manitoba, there was a fair degree of integration between the native and the European populations, such that you had sort of a very mixed race type of people, the Métis, and they had their own special reserve out there. But now I'm just drawing a complete blank on his name. But there was actually a series of revolts. And you know what? I'm just going to Google it right now. Otherwise, it's going to drive me nuts. The Métis revolts.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
yeah, Louis Riel.
Louis
Riel.
Louis
there
Riel,
we go.
yes, yeah.
Yes. So Louis Riel and so they had they were such as the First Nations Cree, Assiniboine, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and they actually rebelled against the British government at the time, like the colonial government at the time. And so it has not been peaceful at always, and there has been flare-ups. And yeah, so some tribes integrate better, some don't. But I think in part because of how Canada's laid out in that 200-kilometer strip, there's a lot of rubbing up against each other on a fairly regular basis. So you have land that you get like the Caledonia one, where there was land that was given over to developers. They had housing developments on them. Mm-hmm. And the native population says, well, that belongs to us. That's native. And so they more or less claim that as native population. And you have these people who are now inside a conquered territory in Caledonia, and they're like, these people are going like, we bought these houses legally, these belong to us. And the natives are like, no, these, so these are the types of situations that you get, that you've had evolving in Canada to some extent.
Well, with Oka, I mean, let's face it, listen, I'm not a big fan of golf, but so maybe I'm biased, but they should just gave them the golf course. Okay. Like it was over a golf course, and the military, you have the famous photo of the Indigenous person with an AK-47. How they got an AK-47 in Canada, I don't know. But, probably through America. Let's face it, through America. The famous photo where the Canadian military officer staring down the Indigenous activist with the AK-47. That dispute, they should have just given them that land. It was to develop a golf course. So a lot of these things, they could be avoided. And there's been, like, in Canada, there's a whole huge, like, cottage industry with these, like, these law schools, because a lot of the Indigenous activists go to become lawyers because, of course, their education is free in Canada. So it's basically to settle these land disputes. And a lot of these land disputes, some of them have gone back for multiple decades, and they still haven't been resolved. There's a huge, especially up north, there's a huge issue with these land dispute claims, which I think in America, I know that there was a lot of issues as well. I mean, of course, Wounded Knee
There
in
were
the 70s.
just a few.
Yeah. Of course, American Indigenous groups tend to be more well armed, but I mean, yeah.
So we're running low on time, but I want to ask you guys one more question before we kind of pivot over to a few super chats we have there. So I guess my question would be, given that the way the government and the media were able to kind of use this, and the way they were able to perpetuate this, the way they were able to be swept up like this, and the way it feels like they're just going to entirely get away with it, right? Like, even though this is proven pretty much entirely false, there's going to be no, like, what does that mean for Canada going forward? Like, is there a hope that you saw the trucker protest, you saw some pushback in Canada through some of the extremes, but like, is there a hope that there will be a resurgent kind of opposition in Canada, something that can actually stand? Or is the government just going to be able to kind of slam this button whenever it feels like it wants to kind of, use Christians or the small percentage of actual conservatives in the nation as a scapegoat whenever they feel it's necessary?
Well, yes, and that not only that, but they clamp down on our guns as well too. So
Oh yeah, can't buy
there's
handguns anymore.
can't buy handguns, and there's a whole bunch of guns. I was just talking with a buddy of mine who's a hunter, and he has some guns that he says, "I'm boy, glad them got these a few years ago." He says because some of the ones, because he's actually he can carry a pistol. He's got all of his licenses. Not a policeman, but has just went through the process, did all things and worked it. But he says, I couldn't get half the guns I own right now anyways to buy the day. But so there's that. Just as Gordon McGill wanted me to note that, the trials for Tamara Lynch and Chris Barber are going on.
It's going on right now.
So these are going on again in the trucker disputes. So their punishments are going to be kept down. And these are, again, you don't hear about it in the news at all because they're quietly getting railroaded. Who knows? I mean, maybe they'll get off.
The audit report was, people were saying that, I hate to say it, but there were certain conservatives in Canada that were like, see, they're going to get Trudeau this time.
No,
but
they're
I
not.
think I said this on the show with Auron. I said, it's sort of like I don't want to bring out Carl Schmidt here, but like he who decides the exception. Like, what did you think was going to happen? The judge was a Liberal Party member. I don't think they're going to punish Trudeau over the mishandling of the trucker situation anytime soon. So
not anytime soon. No, and it's so all of these things are still in the background. I mean, this is one of the sad things that you have in Canadian life is that you can go shopping, you can go to the mall, you can work, but people do not realize the degree to which you just can't say certain things in public, that it's a quasi totalitarian state, in a sense that the state wishes to dictate the totality of your life, and not just how you act but how you think. And so you have to say the right things. You're expected to honk when the native protesters are on the bridge flying their like every life matters flags, all of these types of things. Canada is a country where workers of the world unite is a company. I mean, not a lot of people read Václav Havel, but once you have and you look around and you see workers of the world unite is predominant everywhere. So
in every window.
And they can come down on us pretty much anytime they want to. So the whole system is bought. I mean, with the human rights tribunals. I think isn't even Jordan Peterson's stuff is now finally.
Well, he has to go through a media training program.
Oh, okay.
He doesn't even live in Canada anymore, does he?
No, he doesn't. He'll probably not go.
Yeah, I know.
Well, he's got the Daily Wire money, so he'll, But I have to distinguish though. It's good that Kruptos brought up Václav Havel, because I want to say that Canadians we're not as bad as Europe in terms of like explicit legal fare. I mean, listen, I use my real name and face.
Yeah.
Giovanni Pennacchietti is my real legal birth name, but it's more of the culture of sort of like go along to get along that Havel talks about in the Green Grocer case. That is Canada. It's more of the social conditioning. And eventually probably there will be laws. I mean, the trucker thing was met with brutal crackdowns in states of exception. And well, they don't call it the War Measures Act. What do they call it again? Kruptos. They don't call it the
Oh
War Measures
yeah,
Act.
they acted on all the things that they used to.
Emergency Powers Act. Or
Yeah,
some
Emergency Powers Act. There you go. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And unfortunately, yeah, the opposition in Canada, in terms of people that are conservative or right wing, they unfortunately default to like a lot of American assumptions. And like a lot of these truckers, I mean, God bless them, but like they said, we do have a constitution in Canada, but it's not like the American.
No.
It's like, unfortunately, they consume American conservative, like Fox News media. Ezra Levant and Rebel Media have, catered to more of an American audience by pumping East celebs like Lauren Southern and others in America. So there is like no organic opposition in Canada. That's a big problem. But my last final word would be, well, two things, by the way. I have to say this. I received a text just now, Auron. My girlfriend is a big fan of yours. She really likes your stuff, so I have to say that on air. Before I forget.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, the true cell death has died. You died the real death, but
I know.
I'm glad you have a woman of an exquisite taste, at least.
Well, yeah, she's one of yours, or an American. So, but
well, one day we'll exfiltrate you. Don't worry.
Yeah. But one last a serious point would be that I think you raise a really great question, in that I think that there must be a balance between the needs of Indigenous people in Canada, who have historically gone through abuses, and the needs of Christians in Canada. Unfortunately, we have a government in Justin Trudeau that is not serious in any regard in terms of balancing the issues, but also in terms of just the historic precedent of the Liberal Party, as Kruptos was saying, when it comes to Indigenous issues. They can cause, they could talk about all of the activism they want, but the reality is that the abuses by Indigenous people at the hands of the Liberal Party has been numerous. And the seriousness of these issues will never be met, because we have a spectacle, media-driven administration that, frankly, are concerned with other things and optics rather than the interests of the Canadian people at large, and especially Indigenous people, and especially Christians in Canada. I'm sorry, but the Trudeau government has been, on every issue, largely a failure, because we do not have serious people in charge. I mean, that's the reality of it. Sorry,
and
that's my little rant.
This is not the only, like, the Native issue is not the only issue too. Like, there was recent, like, they are looking for every issue dealing with immigrant populations to basically, like, everything is like, well, we've got to worry about Islamophobia, right? And so the big concern, like, nobody worries about the native-born Canadian Christian population in Canada at all. And so they're always that ready scapegoat there, waiting for things to happen at the side. You have that, you know what I mean? And everybody knows who the thing. And people ask, like, what is it with Canadian radicals? Why are there so many on the online dissident right scene? So many Canadians, and why do these Canadians seem so radical? Well, because once the dime drops for you in Canada, like, and you look around and you realize and you see the state of things, it's like, well, everything that people think is happening in the States, we're experiencing it firsthand right here.
Yeah.
And so then there's just sort of, well, if they've already outlawed everything, I think anyways, I might as well just, go to the wall with it, and just jump in with 2 feet, because there's really, at that point, there's like half measures really don't do it for you.
Well, and another irony being is that among the Indigenous people, I mean, higher rates of church attendance, higher rates of gun ownership, certainly.
I wondered.
Yeah.
I was going to say, a number of course, Native Americans ended up being Christian. So I had wondered how much overlap there was in that Venn diagram. So.
Oh yeah, actually, Gio's right. Actually, they have a higher rate of church attendance than the general population in Canada.
And they could never outright ban guns in Canada because of them as well.
Because of them.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, well, because of their rates of hunting and gun ownership is way higher than the average population. And another thing too, demographically, Canada, as opposed to America, even though America's kind of going that trend with the mega cities and all that, Canada is like an incredibly urbanized population. Most Canadians, in newly landed immigrants, exist in like the major 4 cities: Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, am I missing a few Kruptos? Who else?
You've got the mid-sized cities. So
Calgary,
you got, like,
Calgary,
and then
Hamilton, Edmonton.
Yeah. Kitchener, Waterloo, London.
All around the American border, by the way, mostly So Canada has like the demographic issues in Canada, especially with the rates of immigration which by the way also will affect services for Indigenous people. I mean, not to make the whole like the Liberal Party's the real racist, but immigration in Canada, there's not even a will among the Conservative Party to seriously reconsider this correlation between immigration and the housing market in Canada, and artificially propping up that housing market and the strain on healthcare and education and other vital services, let alone the demographic issues that come with it. I mean, there's really no will in Canada to even discuss these things. So that's why a lot of Canadians on the right, they just go to America. Really.
All right, guys, we do have a number of questions for you. So
we just
rant and rant here.
I love both of you, but neither of you are about brevity, and there are many reasons for you to be angry about Canada. So I don't blame you, but we do have to get to some of the questions here for the people. But before we do that, guys, let's go ahead. I've already had people asking about where to find your work. So Kruptos, if you go first, please tell people, where are you on Twitter? Where's your Substack? Where else can people hear you?
Okay, so on Twitter, I'm at _Kruptos with a K, and then on Substack, it's seekingthehiddenthing.com. So I have bought my domain name, so you'll find it, but just Substack, seekingthehiddenthing.com.
All right, and then Gio, please let everybody know where to find your excellent
work. Well, most people know it from Twitter, so at Giant Gio, but my YouTube, Telegram is Giant Art Productions, as well as my Instagram, where all of my art posting. I've been lacking on my art posting because currently I'm writing a book of art criticism called Neoliberal Kitsch: Art in the 21st Century, which hopefully will be out early next year.
Nice.
I'm plowing through it. And of course, you can find my Telegram as Giant Art Productions. That's where I have my more spicier rants. But please go to my YouTube channel. I need to get more YouTube subscribers for my content-minded podcast. And of course, me and Prudentialist, we have the Digital Archipelago. This week, it's going to be on his channel. Next week, will be on my channel. We're going to have another news-orientated stream. And hopefully next week, we'll have more of an art-orientated stream. We have to cover this British miniseries called Nathan Barley that predicted life in the internet age. So it's going to be beautiful. It's going to be on my channel this week. But tomorrow at 2:15 p.m., it's going to be on Prudentialist's channel. So
and my next piece.
And patreon.com / Giant Productions, and Substack at Gio's Content Corner. Go to patreon.com, or I have PayPal and all that good stuff. Sorry, I have to grift in grift mode.
My upcoming piece is going to be working towards a theology of Netter. So.
Whoa!
Nice. I know. So I've been tooling around. So I'm actually laying out outlines for that. So we're going to work towards try to just begin pushing towards a theology of no enemies to the right.
And what was your previous piece on Kruptos? We were going to cover that in a Twitter space. I forgot about that.
We were going to do that. That was just the one on why we can't, which we should still do, Gio. On why the same thing that Auron and I talked about is why the administrative state can't be reformed. You have to bring it all down.
We've got that episode in the backlog if anybody wants to check it out. It was a very good one. All right, guys, let's go ahead and jump over to our questions from the people. Thogo here for $7 says, why are the former British colonies, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, performing so badly against the socialist assault on liberty? Yeah, guys, what's up with the satrapies? Why are they so much more woke than even the Americas?
They don't have the theology of the American founding. But you go ahead, Kruptos. There's many reasons for this, but
there is. Take this one. It's. I think at some point in time, people just got tired of the cost of having colonies, in a sense of being a conquering nation. So as decolonization occurred, the stories began to get told, and people began to look at this as a quote unquote embarrassing period. You weren't allowed to talk about the triumphs, and it was just sort of a crisis in confidence in Western culture. Sort of happened right around the period of decolonization, as India claimed its independence, as Australia, so all of these things were happening, and so now the one thing you can't do is say that, well, no, British Western culture is a good thing, and we should be imposing it upon you. And this is partly the thing of the residential schools happened during a time when you could still say that, well, it's good to be British and Western, and we're doing these Indians a favor by making them more British. And then all of a sudden, the progressive dime dropped, and the meme changed, and now all of a sudden, it was no longer acceptable from progressive standards to say that. They had lost their confidence in their own culture, and now you had to apologize for it, because that was the progressive. It was just we were mean and ugly, and we should never have engaged in these kinds of imperial actions.
Yep, that's right. All right.
And that's kind of where everything goes now, and that's what really drives it, is that guilt for the imperial past. Sorry.
I think they also know where power lies, and making sure to signal allegiance to it, even at the global level, is essential. For the ruling parties know who butter their bread in all of those countries, and they know that it isn't the American right. All right, so Mr. Clarity here for 10 Canadian. Talking about this with normie Canadians is nigh impossible. There's almost no counterpoint in respectable Canadian media. The orange shirt branding and yearly shame rituals is a slick package. What do you guys think about that? Basically impossible to have pushback because no respectable Canadian media will touch it.
There are pieces here and there, even in the CBC, ironically enough. But yeah, in terms of like the media proper, I mean, certainly the activist class. I mean, my God, they you mentioned Terry Glavin. I mean, they're like leftist activists and NDP people saying that he's part of a G-word-eyed culture, and this is a man who's written about Indigenous issues forever, and it's
like I've because of my education and so forth, and some of the activities we do, we move in and out of managerial class circles and so forth. You want to get a room quiet really fast. It's just to say something offhand, if we had a Trump up here in Canada, I'd vote for him in a heartbeat. And you can just see, you might as well sprouted horns on your head, and the flames of hell like coming up around you. They just simply do not want to hear it. Most Canadians have been, especially in the professional classes, completely brainwormed. Like I know professionals who, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, transgenderism was not a thing. Now they talk about how transitioning children is such a wonderful thing for them, that they can express themselves. And you're like, so like, if you really want to find normie Canadians you can talk to, you've got to get outside of the cities. But then most of them are conservatives, and then you don't have to. But once you get into the cities, almost everyone, you just have to be very careful about who you talk to. I mean, that's just kind of the way it is. You have to be very careful about how you open your mouth up, and who you talk to in public.
Yeah,
it's just the way. Yeah.
Mike Oxlong here for $4.99. Horrifying subject matter, well addressed by great guests. Thanks, gents. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you guys.
Thanks,
I'm glad.
Mike.
Yeah, I was glad we were able to get both of you on to bring this up. And again, Gio taking the fez off, knowing that this is a critical moment, and showing the due respect. All right, and then Tiny Rick here for $1.99. Any thoughts on annexation by America post Caesar? So yeah, we wouldn't do that.
A vision
now.
based world.
Obviously, we don't want you under the auspices of the Biden administration. But once Red Caesar comes, clearly the day of the rake, liberating Canadians from.
Well, it is one of those things that people chuckle at, but because of the nature of Confederation, most people don't realize that it's actually harder to trade within Canada than it is for most Canadian places to trade north and south with the border. So there's a lot of times where provinces have more trade with their natural trades. Like, so Vancouver and British Columbia has more natural ties with the Northwest United States. they're more like California than they are here. The prairie provinces are much more like, Montana, Wyoming. And you think of like the people in Montana and Wyoming and how they are. Well, that's how they are in Alberta and Saskatchewan. People in Ontario, we're basically like the Midwest United States.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
like people in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. That's kind of us, right?
Manifest
then-
Destiny lives on, just goes north.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then Quebec is kind of its own thing, and then the Maritimes. If you read the early histories, the Maritimes, the provinces, that interaction back and forth was quite extensive, right? So all of those natural ties are far more north-south natural than they are. So if, let's say, the U.S. were to break up into various pieces, you could easily see Canada breaking up along with the U.S. and forming those natural alliances. But so it's a very sort of, it's an interesting sort of thing that a lot of people have kind of mused on, that Canada in some sense is kind of an unnatural entity, and would have been much more naturally sort of these north-south type of corridors in terms of trade and culture and so forth.
All right. Well, that is all of our super chats, guys. But I want to thank both Gio and Kruptos for coming back on. Make sure that you're checking out all of their stuff, following them on Twitter, Substack, YouTube, Patreon, all that stuff. Make sure that you're checking out all the links that they were telling you about. And of course, if this is your first time here, please make sure that you're subscribing to the channel. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you can, of course, subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. All right, guys, thanks for coming by. And as always, I will see you next time.